Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing great and enjoy these stories. If you want early access to my videos, then make sure you check out my Patreon in the description where you can get early access. I also have a podcast which is linked in the description, and the only social that I really use is Instagram, so I have a link for that in the description too if you want to see that. So I hope you enjoyed these stories. These were actually some of my favourite that I've narrated, so I really hope you enjoy them as much as I did reading them. Or narrating them technically. So before the video starts, I have a quick message as always. Remember that if you're dealing with anxiety, it's okay and it is completely normal to get anxious about things. But if you find your anxiety is actually becoming a hindrance in your life and getting in the way of normal things, and you can't do certain things that other people seem to be able to without being in a world of anxiety, you could potentially have social anxiety or other anxiety problems that you could fix with therapy and getting the right help. Honestly, sometimes you just need to hear it and realize that the anxiety that you could be experiencing isn't normal. And trust me, there's a night and day difference once you receive help for these things. So, if anybody out there is experiencing that, make sure you check it out and look into it a bit. I think it can make a difference for someone. So I hope you enjoyed these and take care. I'll speak to you all soon. Working as a park ranger, there was lots of crazy things that I've seen out in the woods on my own. I'll go through a few for you today. I remember one time one of my colleagues radioed in saying that he was sure he saw a meteorite or a white UFO crash in the distance one night. I said, okay, I don't know what you've taken, but I'm gonna go and investigate, half joking with him. As I set out in my truck, I realized that there was some kind of emergency beacon, and my god, he wasn't wrong. There was a fire trail in the woods that luckily hadn't spread, and, half expecting to find something from out of this world, I was very surprised to find a plane that had crashed. By the grace of God, everybody lived from the accident and was fine, but it was crazy to see. Honestly, it was like something out of a movie. Now that was my first story. The next one is a complete different thing. It was when I was on vacation in a desert with some of my cousins. Now we were going on this long hike and it was close to nightfall. Now my youngest cousin kept on sprinting off and it didn't bother us because a few of us were actually rangers or had military experience, so we felt relatively safe. Now, my cousin twisted his ankle and we're all quite annoyed because we know how dangerous this is. If it's a fracture or break, it's going to take a while before we can get back to help. Now, I rush over to go and help him, and I also fall down too. I fall down onto rocks and land on some kind of scrub, or destroyed wood. I don't really know how to describe it, but almost like a big bit of wood that's been there for years that was once a tree. Now this thing snaps and my other cousin grabs my arm and says, "Jesus Christ." I say, "Yeah, I know it's slippery here." He says, "No, look." He then shines his torch off to the left and I can see literally hundreds of cactuses below. It was a good 20 feet drop down off of these rocks too. If I had fallen into them, well, I don't even want to think about what could have happened. More than anything, I was just glad that my youngest cousin hadn't gone and got hurt because God, I wouldn't be able to forgive myself if that happened. Now, for my next story, this is more just creepy than anything. I wouldn't necessarily say it was a paranormal experience, but just something really odd. Now, while I was working as a ranger, one particular evening I got a call out to go and investigate a potential illegal fire, and I thought, yeah, that's fine. I wasn't too worried about it. To be honest, normally the fires in the area that I was working in didn't spread very quickly, so you didn't have to worry much. It wasn't like there was going to be huge wildfires, and the firefighting service were extremely good where I was based. I radio in and say I'm only about 10 minutes away, I'll go check it out. Now, I remembered going to investigate this area, and when I got there I can't see anything. There is, however, a strange light just above the tree line. I think this is really odd. It's not like a plane or helicopter, more like a drone, but this was actually in the times before we had drones, so I think this is a bit odd. It eventually flies off really quickly, and I think maybe the military are doing something here. Eventually I make it back to the station and radio in what happened. Someone else answers saying, "Thank God. We haven't heard anything back from you for hours. What happened? We're really worried about you and we're starting to investigate." I confused, say, "No, I was only out for probably 20 minutes. What are you talking about?" I then look over to the clock and I realize that I've been out for a good 5 hours. Even to this day, I still can't explain the experience, and it kind of gives me chills in a way. Now, for my last experience, it's kind of a weird one, but I want to know what you guys think about it. So this story actually comes from a friend of mine and not me directly. He said that he was out on a hike one day when he becomes completely lost. Now, he was lost to the point that he thought he wasn't going to make it back, and he didn't have any communication equipment at the time. He had basic survival training, so was actually okay, but he really thought he wasn't going to make it. Now, one morning when he was trying to figure out what to do or praying for signs of rescue, he sees a yellow dog up ahead of him. He's convinced that he's hallucinating, but he goes over to see what it's doing. It's playing with something in its mouth, and he quickly grabs it off, realizing that it's his shoe. He puts it on again and says, "Hey buddy, what are you doing here?" With the dog beginning to walk off. He decides to follow it. The dog keeps looking back and pointing almost in the direction to go. He says he's accompanied by the dog for at least 2 hours until eventually it runs off down an area that he can't actually see into. Worried about losing his friend, he sprints off after it and he's met by a group of other people. It's a search and rescue team. One of them runs over giving him water saying, "How are you?" He says, "Great, your dog must have saved my life." He looks at him a bit weirdly, then at his buddy and says, "You need some water, bad." And eventually he gets taken off to a hospital. He eventually recovers and is completely fine. He goes to ask some of the rescue team what happened to the dog. Was it a wild one? And they say, "There was no dog there. We didn't know what you were talking about. We thought maybe it was a stray one and you got bitten or something and were going crazy, so we had a look round, but there was definitely no dogs." Now, what makes this even more weird is the fact that my friend still has that shoe to this day, with clear bite marks from a dog that couldn't be made by a person. Now, I'm very lucky where I live. There's a beautiful forest and river that's not too far away. The river starts near the houses and the people, but if you follow it down long enough, you can eventually get over to a really nice secluded area of woodland. Now, I was previously a forest ranger, so as you can imagine, I always like to be out in nature and exploring generally. Now, for a while I didn't actually go out much. I still wanted to explore and whatnot, but I couldn't be bothered where it was extremely cold, so I waited until it became around April, May time, and I once again started following the river. The river had some birds and things on it, and some other big fish that you would very occasionally see in the river. I never bothered to fish any of these because I couldn't be bothered to, but I thought it was a really nice touch. Often I would find myself putting in my headphones, listening to some kind of book or just relaxing music and having a stroll down. I don't know, sometimes you can feel like the world's getting on top of you for no reason, and it's important to just get outside to relax. So in one particular morning I was doing just this. Now I know what you're thinking. Surely if anything scary was going to happen it would be at night, not in the very early hours of the morning, but wait, I'll get to that part. So I set off like normal. I decided to stay far from the river because the rocks actually really hurt my feet sometimes and I have an issue with them. I say hello to one of my friends as I'm walking and I can see that he's just sitting by the rocks having a good time relaxing. People are good, but at this moment I need to get away just to clear my head up. It's still pretty warm at this time, though the weather's been very bipolar. I continue down until eventually I'm just out of sight of the other people. Now, the area that I live in doesn't really have many people to begin with, so you don't have to go very far to be truly secluded or in what feels like the middle of nowhere, and often is. Now, when I'm walking, I see a very large thing flying out of the corner of my eye. I just catch it before it goes off into the tree line, and I realise there's a very large bird there. It's strange because it looks all black and its beak looks very big. I think this is pretty strange because I've not really seen these before. It's hard to describe, but it's like a larger than life crow. I think this is odd and I continue onwards. I turn off my music for a while because I want to save my headphones and phone battery. I continue going and the forest gets a little bit darker, just because there's not much tree coverage. You have to be careful while you keep following this river though, because of course, the further you go in, the harder it is to get out, and I don't really want to be stuck out here alone. Now every so often, I hear this god-awful noise coming from the bird. I can't describe it other than just saying it's a horrifying sound. It's almost like a screech that sounds like it's human, but it's not quite. I haven't heard anything like it since too, which is pretty odd. I assume that it's gotta be another animal that this bird has just gone and annoyed, because surely this isn't making that much sound. I really wish I could describe it to you, but I can't. It's almost like a piercing sound, like metal being scraped, but more biological sounding. It really throws me off when I'm walking because it makes me jump and my eyes actually go blurry for a second from the adrenaline and the panic of it. I decide I should just keep on now. Now, one really strange thing about this is that the bird seems to be following me. Now, I might be paranoid, but I decided to pick up a rock just in case I needed to scare this thing off. I mean, hey, it was ruining my lovely day for me. But eventually, along with my new friend the rock in my pocket, I forget about the bird and continue on my way. As I continue walking, I can see some strange markings on some of the trees. I think the children, or not really children, I guess teenagers or rebels, whatever you want to call them, have gone and put some weird red spray paint onto some of the trees. They're kind of like weird cross symbols, but not exactly. I know this hasn't been marked out by authorities because I know what that looks like from my previous experience of being a ranger. I make a mental note to maybe report this to the authorities so they can stop these stupid kids destroying the beautiful nature. God, I really hate things like that. I love nothing more than untouched nature. I hate when people don't realise the damage they're doing, and that if they do this over time, it's not going to look good. Plus, it's probably not very healthy for the trees, but I digress. I continue on to my walk until it's about midday. The sun's still nice and high in the sky, and I'm just sitting down to relax for a bit. I decide that I can't really be bothered to walk much further because my feet have started hurting from walking on the rocks close to the stream, and I want to get back to eat. I'm starting to get hungry. I have 2 small protein bars, but they aren't really doing it for some reason. As I'm sitting down, I realise that the hair on the back of my neck has stood up suddenly. I think maybe a mosquito's landed on me, and I actually slapped the back of my neck to try and kill it if there is. Nothing. I just slapped myself for no reason. I think that's a little odd. I suddenly noticed some movement again in the distance. Now, I can't make out exactly what it is, but whatever this is on the ground now, and I know for a fact it's not that bird. I think maybe there's some animal around. I'm not really in an area that has big bears or animals like that I have to be scared of, but you never know. If one of these things is hungry and injured or thinks I'm trying to get to its babies, I don't really want to be standing in its way. I decided I should pick up the pace and go a little further. It's starting to get cold too, which is annoying because I've only got my light jumper and shirt on. I originally had the jumper tied around my waist but quickly put it on. Now, as I continue on, I can't shake the feeling that something is just off. I was kind of triggered by the symbols, and that starts to race through my mind again. As I continue on, I stop suddenly and realise something looks off. I look off to the left, and I'm sure I can see somebody standing by a fire moving round. I look to the right just to make sure there's no other ones, and to my left again, and the person vanishes, but where they were standing is exactly the same. It looks a little odd because there's lots of foot tracks around, and they look recent. I decide I should be very cautious now, and slow down for a minute, stop, breathe, and just observe. I definitely can't hear anything, and I decide that it's just my mind playing tricks on me. Now I know what you're thinking, oh, you're a ranger, this shouldn't happen, but trust me, if you're in a job that's that isolated, you actually get used to the fact that sometimes your mind's going to fill in the gaps. It's not necessarily from you being bored, but more your brain. There's a thing where your brain tries to create images that aren't actually there, and I don't know, I'm not a scientist, but look it up and you'll know what I mean. So, I hesitantly make my way over there. As I get there, I realise that the ground seems to have been burned recently by a fire. It's almost like a bunch of people have been dancing around here, but I can't figure out exactly why this is. I look around and there should be people here. The fire's only gone out recently, but there's no one. And then, just to my left, I see movements out the corner of my eye again. I'm not sure why it always seems to be on my left side no matter where I move to. I actually rub my eye to make sure that nothing's in it. And then, I think, what's he doing out here? Why did he make a fire here? I say, hey, and my friend's name, what are you doing? And then there's just laughter. Now the strange thing is, the laughter doesn't seem like my friend, if that makes sense. It's still my friend's voice, but it's not welcoming. I say, hey, where are you? What are you doing? Now I realise something is off. I look around and I cannot see my friend anywhere, but I keep hearing my name being called out. I say, yeah, this is really funny, but what are you doing? I look around and again, I can't see anything. I say, hey, that's really funny, but I'm gonna go now. The voice then says, no you're not, followed by more laughing. Now I'm not afraid to use it. I turn around to leave and the large bird is there, just staring dead at me, almost like it's been waiting. I actually dropped the rock in fear. I didn't realise it at the time because of the adrenaline. It sounded almost like the laughter sounds were coming just from this bird. I pick up the rock again and start clapping, trying to make sounds for it to move, but it doesn't. It's something that I've never seen before. It's literally like a crow, but maybe 3 times as big or 4 times as big as a normal crow. And it doesn't seem to have eyes. I can't really tell because I didn't have my glasses on at the time, but it does not have eyes. I'm almost convinced of this. And I get a really weird feeling wash over me. I hear something behind me. I glance over my shoulder and glance back, and the bird's gone. That's about all I needed for my brain to tell me, it's time you get out of here. So, I decide to start out with a more medium pace. I don't want to burn myself out, and my trainers told me that it's much better that you hike and you don't get injured than if you just sprint out of here. But this feels more urgent now. Now I'm a relatively big guy, I guess, or maybe medium, I don't know. But I know if I really launch a rock I can probably hurt something, so I have my rock in my hand ready to just attack. Now I decide something's definitely off, and I know it's not my buddy playing tricks on me. We used to mess around with each other in the ranger station some days, but never like this. I mean, this is ridiculous even for me. But if this was them playing tricks on me, I'd probably respect it and actually find it really funny, but I decide I have to get on. I think what's weirdest is that the birds followed me so far. I'm not sure whether it's very injured and it wants to eat me when I'm dead like vultures do, but this isn't a vulture. I decide that I should probably get out of here as quick as possible, and great for me, the easiest way to get back is following the river. I've not really been this far into the forest too, so I decide that I can't really afford to get lost here, and it'll probably get quite cold at night and I'd struggle if I couldn't make a fire. I didn't have a lighter on me at the time, so I know this isn't really an option. Again, with my training I can actually make a fire, but I'm not gonna. So I continue going. I continue a mild pace for about 5 minutes before I have to stop because the rocks are really hurting my feet again. I stop for a few minutes and start laughing to myself, thinking, what was wrong with me? And there's a loud splash just to my left again. Why does this keep coming from my left? I say as I slap myself on the side of the head, just enough to try and wake myself up. And there's a large splash of water that just hits me. A large rock has just been thrown into the water next to me, and there's that stupid crow. I throw a rock as hard as I can and it just flies out of the way. What the hell is this thing? I think to myself. Why is it following me? I now break some of my own rules and panic a bit and start sprinting. This is accompanied by laughter of my friend's voice again. Now, you can imagine I went into high gear now. Through the grace of God, I actually didn't hurt myself on the rocks or fall. Well, not for a few minutes at least. I eventually tripped and hurt my leg, and I started laughing to myself as I got up again, saying, this is such a me thing to do, and I continue going. The laughter becomes ever more faint as I continue on, trying desperately to get back. I sprint for a long time, and luckily I'm fairly athletic, so I managed to make it out of the secluded area into a more medium part, if that makes sense, where you're not too far from civilization. I turn around again and realise that I can no longer hear the laughing, and I don't think the crow thing's following me anymore. After a bit longer, I realise that I'm up to relative safety now, and I'm not far from where my friend is. I'm very, very relieved to realise that. When he sees me, he says, hey, what's wrong? I say, yeah, I just had a bad fall, I'm fine, and continue on. I made it home, and of course the first thing I did was call my friend saying, hey, what are you doing right now? He says, oh, I'm just at home with my wife and kids. We've been home all day. I don't need to hear anything else and say, oh great, make up some excuse and end the call. That was confirmation in my mind that this is one messed up situation that I still don't have an explanation for to this day. I don't know what that bird thing was doing or who that person was out there, but I'm glad I never had to find out. I would hate to say it was anything paranormal, but my mind instantly goes to some of the old folklores about creatures out in the woods that can imitate yourself or others. I don't want to say it was that, but I kind of hope it was, because if it wasn't the case, it was probably people with speakers trying to capture or kidnap me, but I just don't think that seems likely with where I live and everything. I don't know, it was a pretty awful experience that I'm trying my best to forget about. And yes, I haven't been back to that area since. Even if I do my own solo hikes now, I don't ever have my headphones in. I'm always listening, expecting to hear that crow or my friend's laughter again. I was hiking with my dad in late September on the west coast of Vancouver Island, which is usually when bears are flanting up for the hibernation are most likely to be aggressive, and since we're a couple of days walk from either the trailhead, we're on high alert. This is where we can only get medical attention, so we're far from safety. It had rained constantly, and we only had seen a single other hiker the whole time. He was travelling the opposite direction, and we had camped beside him 2 nights prior, so for the whole trip, the only tracks that we saw looked remotely fresh, and were a single set of boots hiking coming towards us. It was a pleasant and solitary German tourist, and we'd only seen them in places with extensive overhead cover. The other tracks were washed out and filled with rainwater due to the days and days of constant rain, and it was really making it hard to figure out where to go at times. We were approaching a blackberry patch between ridges and hugged a small creek and smelled what we thought was a particular stinky bear, and since the blackberries were on both sides of the trail, with it only being about 3 meters between them, we have our heads on a shrivel. There was no overhanging trees at this particular berry patch, and there were dozens of meters across, and they're probably 2 meters high. My dad told me to hurry through as quick as we can and made a comment about how smart it was that we have the bear bells on us, and how dangerous it is to startle a feeding bear. He was a couple of meters ahead of me when I looked down and see a footprint. Now, it looked like an unshoed human footprint, except it's probably 2 inches wider and at least 2 inches longer than mine, and I have size 14 feet. There's also dermal ridges and only a couple of inches or so of raindrops, so it had been there recently. I mean, the scariest thing about it was that there was no other prints whatsoever, so it just appeared suddenly almost. It was so startled, probably, but so was I. I looked around as much as I could before my dad lovingly told me, hurry up, and that was the only track that there wasn't now a small puddle in. So before you discount it as double-stepping bear prints, where a bear's gone back before, there's no way it could have crossed that 3 meter distance without leaving more prints. Say what you want about black bears, they're not peaceful or graceful. There are also no grizzly bears here too, and there's no cougar that could have done this. It was also not a hoax too, because we would have definitely seen a person there, and to be interacting with the bears was dangerous to say the least. Now it's pretty weird though. We eventually managed to make it out of there without too much happening, but I don't really believe in Sasquatches, but I don't know what to believe. The more my dad explained it to me, it couldn't have really been a bear, so I don't really know what to think. And on top of that, the smell there was one of the worst things I've ever smelled in my life. I will never forget the image of the raindrops hitting the fresh tracks as I stared in disbelief. I grew up in a small town in western Massachusetts. It was a sleepy little community, and not much happened in the way of excitement. But this weekend, we were going camping. It was a Memorial Day weekend, and it just turned 11. When we got to the campground and got set up, we were mainly by ourselves, and we only saw a few other families along the trail on the way to our campsite, and it was really peaceful. And after a long day of setting up and getting situated, I'm ready to crash out on my tent. Help me, help, oh God, I hear. I woke up like an alarm had gone off, and I can hear this woman screaming at the top of her lungs. She came running into our campsite and was in absolute hysterics with fear. My parents approached her to ask if she was hurt and offered her help. She pushed past and kept running, all the while screaming. We followed her to the ranger station, as did a few other people from nearby campsites. She woke up the entire campground with her screaming. I remember the police showing up and all the flashing blue and red lights. 2 officers were standing around her as the paramedics wrapped her in blankets. She kept saying the same thing over and over again. It's a werewolf, it has to be. The paramedics load her up in the ambulance and it drives away. A few more cops appear and begin searching through the woods. My dad said go back into the tent and sleep. I don't know what happened after that. Sometimes I still talk about the nights that it happened with my parents. We all remembered it and it still gives us goosebumps. I don't know what the girls saw in the woods that night. I don't know if it's still out there. So this story takes place in southeast Texas, within 100 miles of Houston. I was in college but had moved back in with my parents for a semester after some roommate drama. My parents live out in the country, miles outside of town with some acreage. The land in the back of the house consists of 4 zones really. You got to the backyard with the nice St. Augustine. The back, which is a section of woods my parents cleared of underbrush and kept a fairly well-maintained area. The back, which is a clearing that we used to go back to and do bonfires and parties in high school, and then the woods. After high school, my parents kind of gave up on keeping back the brush and weeds and anything except for their nice section of backyard. So imagine a big backyard fenced by a wall of tall weeds and large trees that goes back for a while, then a giant field of weeds, transitioning into soil and dense woods and some oak and pine wood. I also had this dog that my parents let me keep outside. They had a big chain-link dog who lived in there since my parents had no permitting fencing besides some barbed wire at the very back of the property, and this dog wasn't really the kind to stay in one area. It was a fact that she was so aggressive to other dogs, always going after them and acting tough. I sometimes worried she'd go out and get some of the chickens. She was about 60 pounds too. Now, since I was in college, I had no curfew or anything and would always come home late at night / early morning after hanging out with friends or studying or whatnot. On this particular night, it was pretty cold out. Even though she still had a house and bed and straw out there, I felt bad for my dog, so decided to bring her in to sleep in the garage. I should mention, now I probably should have been more careful because this happens quite a lot, but somehow this dog always got me. She would wait in the back until the gate was unlocked and I was in the run, the gate closed with the unlocked horse latch. Run around me and pop the gate latch with her nose and bolt off, so of course she did it. And I was standing there in the cold in the middle of the night, annoyed because I knew I had to find her and return her. The moon was pretty bright and I had seen her flying into the weed wall and disappear, so I followed her into the night, calling her name. There were some little trails through the weeds and we tried to keep open so that we can access the property, but they were less wide than a person can walk through and the weeds are taller than my head. It was dense. Anyway, I'd gone a ways and we had passed through the wooded section out into the clearing, and I get quiet, trying to listen to where she's gone, and I hear intermittent rustling out in the woods, which at this point I've got to point out is a really dark outline of the tree line and weed jungle. The rustling wasn't the sound I expected, since she usually crashes through the woods. In my head, I'm thinking, what the hell is she doing now? Honestly, I thought she's probably rolling around in some dead skunk, and I was going to have to bathe her. Figuring it was my wild dog making the noise, I call out her name again. As I got closer, it becomes apparent the rustling is not the sound of an animal charging through the underbrush, but more like something intentionally shaking the trees. Like if you grab a branch and shake it, and all of the connected trees and vines shake too. It was close enough now to make out individual branches silhouetted at the top of the tree line, and I could see that whatever was going on was causing the trees to shake all the way to the top. This was off, and decidedly not my dog pacing around. I'm quiet and freeze. I hear in all these stories people talking about how they notice something in the woods go silent. I can't remember this happening really, but as I stood there, I clearly hear 2 or 3 loud deep huffs. I guess it kind of sounded like a ball with a deeper fluctuating, kind of fluttering sound. And it seemed to be coming from around my head height. For some reason, my mind kept registering that this thing was a lot closer to me than the tree line. I remember the distinct feeling that the noise is directed towards me, and I get a feeling in my gut like my whole body is stuck. Now, rational or not, I yell my dog's name, and with all my fear and urgency, I turn and ran as hard as I can. Either my dog heard my tone and got scared, or she was scared of whatever was in the tree line, because as soon as I crash through the weeds, she comes off on my left like a bullet. When I got to the open garage, she was trying to get in, desperately jumping. I closed the garage and put her in the kennel and went to bed. I don't know what it was, and at the time I convinced myself it was one of those hog sealers that you hear about on the news. I've been around plenty of cattle and have never heard one make a noise like that. Not saying it could have been something dodgy, but it just doesn't seem right. This was like 10 years ago, so I'll never know for sure, but I'm trying to think real hard of what it could have been in terms of a logical explanation. My uncle has a large area of wooded property in Missouri. It's about a 1.5 hour drive from St. Louis. He has a cabin there, a small man-made lake, and trails throughout the woods. When we visited, we would spend a lot of time driving ATVs down the trails. One of the trails leads to an abandoned mining area. The area has a toppled over mine shaft, a couple of cement buildings, and a sheet metal storage shed for core samples. And the sheet metal building with showers has a couple of rooms. There's a metal fence separating the two sections of it, which are mostly intact. A lot of the area hasn't been used for mining for lots of decades, probably even a century. All of this lies in a large open area that has no trees and just sand and mud flats, which made it a perfect place to drive four-wheelers. We'd visit a few times each year, and take out the four-wheelers out to the flats and have a great time riding. We never felt unsafe, and sometimes we would even go out to night to stargaze. Eventually we begin to realise that there's these sights popping up at the edge of the woods around the flats, like sticks stuck in the ground, in lines or weird circle patterns, almost like burn piles. And there was eventually shotgun shells, bullet casing, and beers around sometimes. We'd even see weird symbols on the floor. It was made out of trash or spray painted. Basically, it looked like people were shooting targets and drinking out on the flats with a touch of weirdness with the symbols. I didn't really think much of it, and we just decided that we wouldn't go out at night and started carrying guns around with us when we go out. What finally did it for me and kept me from going back out there is when we discovered that the fence has been nearly completely destroyed. Only the posts are left, and on every post there's some can or jar of something on top. And throughout the flats on the trails, it's rampant with these weird things everywhere. Kind of like containers stuck onto the end of branches and whatnot. Again, it wasn't too weird. Like, we know people like to go out on break and stuff and just do stupid things, but what got us was the scope of it. The fence was probably 1/2 mile in length, and every section of metal mesh had been removed, which would have been considerable because it would take a long time to do it and you'd actually need bolt cutters. And that alone wouldn't be too weird, but the thing is, none of the metal was gone. That was probably the most valuable thing. I would understand if they took the metal, but why would they just leave it there perfectly intact? Now, the last time that I was actually brave enough to go out there was 10 years ago. I've now moved states and have limited contact with that part of the family, so I don't know if anything else has happened. So it's nothing paranormal, just really weird. My husband and I always love to go camping. We live in CA and set aside 2 weeks every summer for a camping trip where we can get away and disconnect from the real world. Normally, we hit Death Valley for some backcountry adventures for a few days, then heading off into the mountains for some fishing. On the way back home, we usually stop for one last hurrah in Eastern Sierra. On this particular trip, my husband, myself, and our German Shepherd, Ginger, are going. We ended up finding a lake to swim in for the day, and when we got tired, decided to find a spot to camp. We were both pretty familiar with that area, and knew that there was a free campground about 12 miles up the mountain. I never liked the Pacific campground because it was very cold at night at that elevation, even in the summer, but whatever. It was free and we had plenty of firewood. We pulled into the campground and there was only one tent pitched, but we didn't see any people at all. In fact, The whole evening, there was not a single other person in sight. I loved it. It's really nice when it's empty and it feels primitive and nice and remote. So it was rare even to see a car driving past. After we got set up, the beer was flowing very freely. We were pretty trashed and hung out for a bit, cooked dinner over a campfire and hit the sack. My dog husband and I were all asleep and awoken by an ungodly scream in the middle of night. One of us grabbed the phone to see what time it was, and then my husband gets his gun, told me to stay there, and went out to see what was going on. Of course I want to peek out, and there was one guy standing right in front of the other tent that was set up across the stream, looking at the sky and just screaming. It was a horrific scream, loud and terrifying, normally just like something that would prompt a phone call to the police, but due to the area's remoteness, the cell signal is non-existent. My husband didn't want to go over there for obvious reasons, so he came back to the tent, and I don't think any of us slept a wink the rest of the night. The next morning we packed up and left as soon as we could. That same tent was still there, but again, no one in sight. We actually drove past there a couple of days later, out of curiosity, and the tent was still pitched in the same spot. There were no other campers there. This is about 10 years ago, and when we visited the area frequently, this was about 10 years ago, and we still visit the area frequently, since we now have a cabin about 20 miles from the campground. When we take a drive up the mountain and pass that campground, the scream is always the first thing we think about and wonder what was happening. I'm going to try and keep things clean and concise and to the point, so I'm going to start with the creepy but natural. I've been a hunter since I was like 13, maybe earlier, so I don't really remember, but being out in the woods since I was young means that I get to see or hear things that I can normally ensure that I wouldn't see in the cities. I've had a few different instances where I've been thoroughly creeped out in the woods, and I'll get to them, but I want to start with a not as bad one. So the guy who owns the land that we hunt on decided it was going to be a good idea to store some of the equipment on his land, one of which is a styrofoam float. Now, one year we got out there to check it out and pick it up, and that big piece of styrofoam had met its demise to a bear. Now you could tell that the bear really had a go at this thing because it was torn to shreds. Now, it almost looks like a bomb had gone off next to it. It makes you kind of worried about what bears are actually capable of. But anyway, now to the first real story. I was stalked by a cougar a few years back. When we had a deeper opener, I liked walking through the roads occasionally, and one of the first things I noticed this year is that I could have taken a picture of a set of tracks, really big tracks. I wish I did. The cat was obviously stalking over other animals in the area, but me being me, I decided that I shouldn't be scared of that, and it's probably more scared of me, but sure enough I jinxed myself. I attempt to do a deer push through some of the real thick brush to try and jump up and scare a deer and get it to move through towards the other hunters in my party. I'm going to get to that soon, and I'm moving through the woods, yet I can hear something moving behind me. Every time I would stop, the noise would stop. I eventually got nerved, especially with the forest being quiet, and I decided that I'm going to get attacked by something that's found me. It's probably better if I'm facing it. So I turn around and walk straight back the way I came from and raise my weapon. When I began retreating back to where I come from, directly towards whatever it was making the sounds, I see a tan flash of fur and a long tail low to the ground turn around and run away from me. Then, the next day as I was doing a walk up to the main road with my rifle, I'm close to the tree line when I hear a deep growl. Immediately to my right, I turn my rifle to see the face of the cougar at my stomach level because it was raised up on the ground and towards the dirt. I calmly backed away and walked up towards the road that I came from. Now for wolves. One of my favourite ones, and it's quite a simple one. A few years back, My dad shot a deer and we gutted it. If anyone here is familiar with the field dressing of an animal, you typically gut the pile just out in the woods. This was like that this year, and we found out that there's a wolf pack that had actually moved onto the property. So, my dad leaves a gut pile a couple of 100 yards away from the stand. The day after, I was sitting in my dad's stand while he was doing a big loop on the property trying to scare deer towards me, and he was getting close to me, which I didn't know at the time. I was sitting in the stand and I heard a kind of wolf yelp from the gut pile. I texted my dad and told him he better hurry up because there's a wolf pack between us. Sure enough, by the time he made it back to me, he also heard the same thing, and it was within less than 100 yards away now. This year, just in November, I actually took pictures of old tracks very close to the trail and next to my size 13 boot, and the tracks are huge. I know there's one set of 4 that are walking together. I took a picture of the biggest tracks and I found out the wolf's probably 200 pounds or more, so it's definitely something you don't want to encounter out there. Now, for the one that sticks with me, this is the one that I want you guys to hear. Somewhere around 2006 or 7 when I was a late teen, I was at my grandpa's cabin and with my grandparents and my cousin. This was the last summer in northern Wisconsin, Danbury to be specific. The incident happened in midday when the sun was high in the sky and it was pretty warm out. My cousins and I decided that we would play some airsoft, and I was wearing camouflage and decided that I would have a better chance of not being seen this way and being able to ambush him by going into the woods, which was about an acre attached to where the cabins are off to, though it was really an acre that my grandparents owned. Now there were trails cut through and a big entrance which splits into a Y and loops around. This was used as a short ATV trail. Now while we're battling with the airsoft guns, we continue all the way up into the trail about halfway. We were still both winded and at the top of the hill next to a clearing in the woods when I decided to mess with my cousin and shush him and say we're being watched. Now mind you, I intended this as a joke, but we both got quiet. I realised the woods were dead quiet, like you could hear a pin drop. I could only hear my own breathing and immediately feel like we're being watched, so I look in the directions all around us and try and figure out where this thing's coming from, scanning from edge to edge, and look into a clearing that goes down to a hill and a watering hole or pond or something. We're sure we're gonna see animals there. I scan left to right, then back and halfway on the right, really trying to focus on what was going on. That's when it came into focus, when I saw teeth. Teeth in the mouth of what looked like a wolf panting, except it's very tall. I mean, it's probably like to my stomach or chest height, and I'm 6'4". As I was taking in these details in a short amount of time, I realised the thing is staring at us, maybe even more at my cousin who's smaller than me. And I also realised that this wolf was not on all fours, but crouching on its back legs against a tree, with its arms wrapped around the tree. That's right next to its arm. And this thing's almost holding its arms out to us with its long claws. In the short time that I looked at it, I said to my cousin that we have to go. Now my cousin took off like a bat out of hell. Being a baseball player, he was a bit quicker than me. He ran and I looked back at the creature and it locked on with laser focus, took my cousin and stood all the way up and began running towards us, which makes me run. What I remembered from it is that it was significantly taller than me, completely upright, and when I ran, I could hear it crashing through the woods behind me. After running and running, we eventually reached the wire, and this thing is standing there, waiting for me. I told my cousin go, go, go. We ran into the parking area by the shed and stopped talking because it sounded like it stopped chasing us now. At this point, we agree we can't tell our grandparents because what we saw essentially appears to be a werewolf and probably is more likely a bear, but I don't know. Unfortunately, my cousin never actually got to look at it other than just a flash of reddish fur, maybe more of a brown colour. But then again, he's lucky because every time I think about it I get scared. I'm leading up to this, and even afterwards, I've always had a bad feeling about that night. Now, whenever I'm by the campfire, I always feel like I'm being watched. One of the things for you guys to memorize is that if you're out in the woods, if the woods go quiet eerily, most likely there's a large predator in the area. If you have a gut feeling, you should just follow it. Gut instincts are the reasons that our ancestors stayed alive. If I'd frozen fear, we would have died. I have one last thing to add, which is from a few years ago when I was hiking with my wife in a local park. We got followed by an unknown animal. As we're moving up through the trails through the woods, there is something tracking us, moving as we're moving, stopping while we stop. What made this weird is that it wasn't like a normal animal, but it sounded like we were really being followed tree to tree, and it sounded big. The reason why I said this is the thing chased me and my cousin, and people say that it's a dog man. They say that they're intelligent and apparently good at tree climbing. I also say that these creatures are apparently really good at following people, and seemingly managing to stay out of sight for a long while.